But what I'm going to do is present this paper, which is from two University of Sydney professors and one from Denmark. So the topic is the delusion and deception in large infrastructure projects, two models for explaining and preventing executive disaster. Now, a lot of the concepts in there are pretty generic across any projects, and that's what I've sort of tried to. I'll try to sort of talk in more generic terms because not everybody's in capital projects. So first off, they set the scene. They've got three sort of case studies that they use, sort of background and large infrastructure projects. I mean, the one that they used in there was the Sydney Opera House, and some of the stats I didn't know, being Canadian originally, came afterwards. But 1959 was construction start. Drawings and funding were not fully available. The initial budget was 7 million, which I can't believe. It opened in 1973, 10 years late, and the final cost was 102 million, which is 1,400% cost overrun, which is like a world record. And those are the real stats. But in reality, there was, and they break these things down in the same way, but there's a political side to it. So really the cost overrun was about 100%. So the project really started for political reasons, and that's why those numbers were there. They talk about typical causes of underperformance in large projects: complexity, technical challenges, lack of scope clarity, unexpected geological finds, and mixed stakeholder messages. And the concept that they wanted to bring in and that they do in this article is, well, those things, at the end of a project, that's what we say is what happened. But when did we know it? And in reporting, we obviously knew it at some point, and then there was this deception or delusion that was happening, and how do we sort of address that? So that's really the core of the article. And there's a couple of good quotes that I wanted to just mention that I thought were in there. So managers make decisions based on delusional optimism rather than on a rational weighting of gains, losses, and probabilities. They overestimate benefits and underestimate costs and time. They involuntarily spin scenarios of success and overlook potential for mistakes and miscalculations. I don't think you need to be in infrastructure for that to be true. That's across the board. Yeah, that's right. But every change program that I've ever heard about in any company, would probably be of the same. There needs to be a version of like a wooden spoon sort of trophy for these things. I don't know. What are the reasons for forecasting errors? And they break it into three categories: delusion, deception, and just bad luck. For that forecasting. So what happens in that forecasting that makes it go wrong? So delusion, they define it as cost underestimation and benefit overestimation in predictions, which is that forecasting piece. And they define it into a couple of categories where they help define it. One is planning fallacy, which that's a tendency to underestimate task completion times and costs. And it's just when you're looking at something from a bottom up, they call it an inside view, but it's a bottom up view. They also talk about anchoring bias. So for those who don't know, the first number that is considered as a possible answer to a question serves as an anchor. Even when people know that the anchor is too high or too low, their adjustments away from it are almost always insufficient. And it's a prelude to sort of opening up to the other human anchors that or human biases that people have, other than biases: confirmation bias, sunk cost bias. There's a whole plethora of those out there. So that's how they define delusion, and that's part of this article, is to sort of just define what that issue is. The second one is deception. So that is the political and organizational pressures in decision making. So again, thinking about the Opera House, there would be huge amounts of political pressures around a project of that size. Any change program and any initiative, there's massive politics that happen. White anting by executive A versus promoting by executive B. That's just normal practice. And so they break that into a couple of sections as well. One is what they call a principal agent problem. So it's complex structures creating incentives to provide biased estimates. So that's I'll use infrastructure first. If I'm a client, a customer, and I use an agent to help assess the performance of, Ish, who might be doing a subcontract for me, that subcontracted consultant is incentivized to find problems with that work. And it just creates a barrier. And how do you get through that when you do project reporting and forecasting? You've always got mixed messages there. So that's kind of what they're looking at. They talk about taxpayers versus state governments, local governments, analysts and planners, contractors, all at work in a very complex web of incentives. And the next thing they go on to, which sort of relates to that, is sources of strategic deception. So this is self-interest, asymmetric information, differences in risk preferences, and time horizons. So again, with that in mind, state governments versus, an analyst, a planner, or a contractor, the interests are very different. There's a lot of public servants that we've dealt with who think that, if we make money, they haven't done their job. The lawyers at 10 paces that happen, is in a procurement process. All of those are different interests from different perspectives. That all makes sense, but when looked at it from the outside or from a whole, you can see that there's some real issues that happen. Asymmetric information. So in infrastructure construction, people who understand the site that might be in front of us, what might be in the ground, and having that information versus somebody in politics who's looking to get something signed off, that's a massive gap in information about what the cost could be, the time issues, and usually if somebody doesn't want to know, and again, translate this into generic, org structures for change or any other type of project. If somebody doesn't want to know because it's better for their career, their bonus or whatever, they'll go to great lengths to make sure that they don't know that information. Differences in risk preferences, and this is pretty significant actually through the article. So that's where all these different parties, have different risk tolerances. And as projects run through a life cycle and different financiers, subcontractors, consultants, and so on get involved, everybody wants to minimize risk, but has to take on some risk for that job. That's what they get paid for. That's what they're coming to the table for. But the trick is to try and minimize risk for yourself and pass that on as much as possible to others. And that's just the self-interest of every company that's out there. So that's one of the key things that needs to be managed. And in the article, they talk about it from an outside view, external, about how that should be done. And a lot of McKinsey articles that I've read, PwC, you name it, they talk in very easy terms about how the party that is best prepared to manage that risk should take that risk. But in reality, it doesn't really work that way. It's the person who's in the chair who can pass on that risk because it's a hot market or a buyer's market versus the other way around. That's the risk that they're going to pass on. It's just normal. A bank's just never going to give you, a better outcome than they can get away with. That's just the way it is. So, and then time horizons. So again, political pressures around election cycles. They want to announce projects, they want a ribbon cutting, and that's really all they care about. Opera House. The politics behind that versus when it was actually going to be used, and the benefit of having performances was, I'm sure, a very distant second to it's in my electorate and I want this for this election. And then there's the bad luck. So there is those things that happen, but you do have to account for the honest players that are trying to put up a best forecast that they can, and then stuff happens. There is that complexity, the chaos theory sort of stuff there, where you just don't know when something's going to hit you, and that's where contingencies and so on come into to normal project management. And then a good quote from the article: delays and cost overruns are tolerated unless the local government is held responsible. And look, I don't know about you, but the last time a local government was held responsible, I just don't remember that. So So that's, I think, gives you a sense of how they're determining project forecasting issues. They're putting into those categories. And a key thing is that delusion and deception are complementary, but rather than alternatives of failure. And the largest areas occur when they're happening together. So when you put one on top of the other, that's when you get these massive cost blowouts and projects that just are nowhere near where reality is. So they map out incentive alignment versus ability to learn from decisions, and whether you're aligned or misaligned for incentives, and whether you've got good and poor ability to learn from key decisions is really sort of how this stuff lines up. So they use weather forecasting as an example of everybody's aligned. Everybody wants to know what the weather is. Those forecasters who get it wrong all the time, well, there's no incentive for them to lie. they're all trying, we're trying to do it, and we're all trying to, give them the best information or download the app or whatever. So everybody's all aligned with weather forecasting. They put road and rail projects in as these, misaligned and poor ability to learn, with rail projects being at the top because they don't happen quite as often. And they've got one-off concert halls, stadiums. So they are issues where it's difficult to, they're not commodities. So they are one-off designs, a lot of lessons that it's a big struggle on a day-to-day basis to get, those right lessons into the teams that are dealing with them. Whereas something along the lines of a software, a game completion announcement, which is something to get somebody to start buying a software, would be misaligned incentives, but pretty good ability to learn because that stuff happens on a regular basis. And I guess it's, if anybody's heard of the Sinafin framework, where you've got simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic environments, it helps to know which environment you're in so that you know what incentives are at play, how to react to the environment that you're in. So in the Sinafin thing, a complicated environment, you want to look for expertise and bring that in at the right place at the right time. If it's chaotic, you want to have a leader who's just going to forge a way forward. It doesn't really matter which way, if it's right or wrong. Knowing that is, which scenario you're in helps you decide, what kind of tools you want to bring to bear. This is their way of sort of having a very similar approach to say, well, understanding where you're in. If you're again, as a PMO, and there's a project that's putting up a forecast that's not correct, whether it's delusional, whether it's, this gives you that framework to try and break it apart and give you an idea of how to react to it. So then they give some options, or there's some suggestions about how to overcome delusion and deception. So delusion first. So they talk about a greater use of independent peer reviews, and I think that's pretty much a no-brainer. Having a third party, and PMOs, that's usually what they're there for, is to have sort of a third party go into projects and do an assessment. I think the critical thing is that it has to be outside of line management reporting. As soon as you're in that line, that same management reporting structure, well, then you've got a lot of the same power situations happening. You've got a lot of people who won't, step over the line of a general manager who they might be reporting to, for example. They say the key is to have a good learning environment. Look, I think that's a great statement. In every company I've been in, there's always a knowledge management initiative that's happening. There was a good quote that I remember once, which was, if you're not learning at the same pace as your competitors, you're losing knowledge capital, which I think is stuck with me, which I think lines up to that. So any advantage, strength, weakness is always relative to competitors. And this isn't part of the article, but that learning environment, you need to at least be aware of, I think, what's happening across your market and at least be a little bit above that. Reference class forecasting is a big process that they talk through in a large part of the article, in a 5-step process. Basically, it's decision maker must reference past comparable cases when making predictions. And in my mind, that's just benchmarking. I think all of us in some regard, benchmark to certain prices or whatever the issue may be. The thing that they're trying to do is present that the issues that you're dealing with on this project, whatever that forecasting issue is, if you can create a benchmarking of other cases where, I have to use infrastructure here, but if the timing to set up some temporary works, for example, has taken you, 10 weeks in the past, and you're saying it's going to do 6, that benchmarking gives you a pretty good handle on that it might be outside of the norm. I'll talk about my views on that as well, but the key thing for them is that it's done independently. They then talk about the gap between that intuitive forecast that was done previously to the benchmarking. They have a statistical method to just sort of bring it in and use that as a step of where you want to put the real marker. And then the key is to choose a similar class of situation to the focal problem. And that's really the rub in my view. I mean, to be able to, if it was such an easy problem that it could be easily benchmarked, it's usually not one that is really that any of us would deal with on a regular basis, I believe. So that's how they talked about overcoming delusion, overcoming deception. So They talk about accountability and transparency. So financial incentives should be given to the agents of taxpayers. And I'm just going to read these because I'm not sure any of these are really feasible, but institutions proposing the project should share financial responsibility for cost overruns and benefit shortfalls. Private financiers must participate without a sovereign guarantee. Strict forecast audits, which I think agree with, and criminal penalties for misleading forecasts. Well, now you're going to start paying people to provide a forecast. I guess I'll put my spin on this right away. The other thing that I think is relevant is that this is a wicked problem, and it's a great name, but it's a problem that has multiple parties, huge investment required, interconnected issues. No one party can actually come to bear and solve this problem. And there's lots of them, that exist, but it's a certain type of problem where being outside of it and looking in, it seems so obvious that all these players should just play nice, and why doesn't the banking institution just give them the money and take some risk in this? That does sound great, but when you're into it and you have the incentives at play, and it just doesn't work like that. They did have another really good quote that I'll mention. Any individual project is often a once-in-a-career decision for a public or private executive. Thus, it is difficult for executives to learn from their own prior mistakes. It's rare for executives to deliberately learn from similar projects others have attempted. The first half of that, I think, for infrastructure is especially relevant because, these projects that out the window, we're talking years that they exist in, whereas, if you've got projects that have a shorter time frame, you should have executives that have some learning under their belt. Maybe not at first, obviously, but you'd expect that. And then the second half, deliberately not learning. I think there's the political side of it that comes into play as well. Like if I've got a 5-year horizon on my role at this company, as most executives do these days, and this project's going to extend past that, well, all I have to do is get this across the line, be the hero to sign it off, and that's my incentive. I don't have to live with the asset management side of things and the OpEx of it, as we were saying before. And so let's just sign it off, get it across the board. I'm out of here. I collect my bonus and all's good, and then I'm on to the next thing. So I think there's those misalignments of time horizons are especially relevant in this. So that's kind of the article in a short form. I'll give you a couple of starting arguments for it, and then we'll open it up. So the first one I sort of alluded to. So capital projects start with funding. As the first step of any of this stuff, investors and their agents will not voluntarily take on risks such as a project performance. This starts the waterfall of what risks are passed through to those who may not be best placed to manage it. So how do you change how risks are allocated from somewhere in the middle of a project lifecycle? So stepping out of infrastructure for a second, we've all been in a project or a program where you're in the middle of a life cycle. Things have been kicked off. It's not running the way it should. How do you stop things and reset them? I think that's something, and so if you get into delusional forecasting, especially relevant there, where you come across a project that's got a really bad report or forecast or whatever it is, how do you actually pedal back and reset the scene? So that's an argument that I think plays against that what the paper said, but one that I think would be good for us to sort of talk through. The second one is approving institutions may not have the expertise to forecast these cost overruns that they keep talking about. This is why they contract a specialist. All projects rely on specialists to some degree. And what is the value of carrying repetitive and redundant overhead structures? So, at some point, again, you're getting a delusional forecast. What repetitive overheads do you keep at what levels? And how do you make those calls? Because it's easy to say that, well, look, why don't we have a completely redundant function that can sit over top of the project and second guess them on everything. And that's how we'll get a better report and a better forecast. But, I'm not sure that that's the best use of that money for those overheads. And so that's just something I think we could debate. It's very difficult to evaluate two options and competing project plans in a tender phase. Each will be backed up with a methodology and assumptions. So how can you decide which is more realistic? So again, from an academic view, they're talking about, well, these forecasts were not realistic because obviously the cost overruns happened and they were 1,400 times. But that's looking at things from a really, distant hindsight. When you're in the thick of it, they don't really offer up any real lessons. And I think that would be really good to talk through if anybody's got some experience on that or some good practices. I've got a few, but that definition of a realistic forecast, well, that only exists after the fact. When you're sitting there evaluating it, there's all these factors at play. You've got to make that call. It's not as easy as that. And then finally, when you're not in a commoditized market, benchmarking, especially around a specific relevant problem, is inherently difficult. Complexities of the situation make lessons difficult to search and to translate into whatever environment you're putting them into. And that's that knowledge management piece. So, it's great to have, what they call an outside view of benchmarking, and that'll give you, a really good down to a 10% of what this project will outturn cost should be. But really, the intricacies, the technical unique challenges that are being faced, how that's combined with time pressures, how that's being compared with budget pressures, all those things combined really do make a pretty unique environment. So that is the article and some initial thoughts. I guess I'll now open it up to the group to argue.